Welcome to Demon Sleep. I'm here to help you unwind tonight. If you enjoy this space, feel free to like and subscribe. Tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is. It makes this feel like a shared night across the world. These stories are different, and I'm glad you're here. Dim the lights, let the room settle, and let's begin. Story 1, Through Leela's Eyes. The road stopped feeling real an hour ago. By the time the signal vanished, the car was already committed. Tires humming over pavement that had thinned into a suggestion, trees pressing in like they were trying to listen. He should have turned around when the map froze, but the directions had been precise, almost insistent. Latitude, longitude, no address, just a point in the mountains. That point turned out to be a house that didn't belong to the land around it. An old mansion stood alone on a scraped hill, its paint worn down to the color of bone, its windows catching only branches and clouded sky. Autumn forest wrapped it tight on all sides, swallowing sound, swallowing light. Afternoon should have been brighter. It was. He parked beside a dented van with out-of state plates and sat there longer than necessary. His fingers were locked around the wheel. When he finally loosened them, a band of gold flashed back at him. The ring, still there. He hadn't meant to bring it into this place. The front door was already open. He climbed the steps, boards groaning under his weight, and waited for a greeting that never came. Inside, the entryway stretched long and narrow, walls stained in colors that felt bruised rather than painted. A staircase rose ahead, its upper half swallowed by shadow. From somewhere far inside the house came the sound of a child laughing. It wasn't playful. It was careful, rehearsed, like a sound learned by listening to others. He crossed the threshold. The door behind him didn't close, but the air changed anyway, sharp, cold, carrying a faint tang of metal. His shoes made no noise on the floor, none at all. A woman stepped out from a side room with an armful of folded sheets, pale blue scrubs, tired eyes. She passed so close her sleeve brushed his jacket. He tried to speak, to explain who he was and why he'd come, but she kept moving, already turning into another hallway as if he hadn't existed. Along the walls, thermostats blinked softly. Every single one showed the same number. The room was cold enough that his breath misted when he exhaled. Something moved upstairs. Footsteps light, uneven, wrong for an adult. A door clicked shut. He didn't remember choosing to climb the stairs. He only realized he was doing it when the first step creaked beneath him. At the landing, a narrow corridor stretched ahead. 5 doors. 4 closed tight. One at the far end stood ajar, spilling white light into the hall. Beyond the opening, he caught glimpses of shapes that didn't belong in a house like this. Metal frames, tubing, machines humming softly to themselves. He slowed as he approached. The girl on the bed looked up before he reached the doorway. She was small, younger than he'd expected. Her dark hair cut straight and blunt like it had been done without care. Her eyes followed him with unsettling accuracy, tracking every shift of his weight, every hesitation. She wore thin striped pajamas despite the cold. Beside her, a clear bag hung from a stand, liquid inside slowly dripping away, already more empty than full. She didn't look surprised to see him. Her gaze moved deliberately from his face to his hands to the ring that glinted when the light hit it. For just a moment, something passed through her expression. Not fear, not sadness. Understanding. When she spoke, her voice was soft and steady, the kind people use when they're trying not to hurt someone. "Oh," she said gently, "they haven't told you yet." The words settled into the room like dust, and suddenly the quiet felt heavy enough to crush him. The girl's name was Cora. At least, that's what the small plaque beside her door said. She didn't interrupt him when his mouth opened and closed without sound. She simply watched, patient in a way children usually aren't, then tipped her head toward the ceiling. Up, one more level, find the green door. The gesture was simple, almost polite, but her eyes lingered on his face with something darker underneath. Not fear, not urgency, a caution he didn't yet have the language to understand. The stairs to the third floor felt steeper, tighter, as if the house were folding in on itself. At the top, the hallway stretched far beyond reason. Too long, too straight. The kind of space that ignores logic. 5 doors lined the walls again, evenly spaced. 4 were dull and lifeless. The 5th was painted green. A shade once meant to mimic trees, now deepened into something old and shadowed. David knocked. Nothing. He reached for the handle. It didn't move. He knocked again, harder this time. From inside came a faint pattern of sound, soft, repetitive, unsettling, like something scratching, stopping, scratching again. Not frantic, deliberate. Then suddenly silence. Before he could react, the door across the hall opened. The man who stepped out matched the photograph perfectly. Same sharp cheekbones, same silvered hair, same thin glasses that caught the light just enough to hide his eyes. He wore muted browns from collar to cuffs, blending into the corridor like he'd grown there. Without a word, he turned and walked back into his office, leaving the door open. David followed. The cold hit him immediately. Not a draft, an absence of warmth. His breath bloomed white in the air. The man didn't seem to notice. He sat behind a desk buried under folders and thick journals, moving with unhurried certainty. David lowered himself into the chair opposite him. It felt wrong, too small, like it was meant for someone younger, lighter. The headmaster opened a file. David recognized it by the tab before he saw the name. His life flattened into paper. The man read silently for a moment, then looked up. His face carried no softness, no cruelty, just accuracy. He spoke like someone reading weather conditions. Wife deceased, 4 months ago, highway accident, professional leave, colleagues concerned, a recommendation for distance, for a change. David waited for the pain. It didn't arrive. The words felt remote, like they belonged to another man whose life he'd once overheard. He tried to explain how he was ready, how he needed the work, but the conversation had already shifted. The headmaster spoke of the house instead. 8 children, ages 7 to 12, all seeing the same kind of things. Faces that shouldn't be there, people already gone, families overwhelmed, schools unable to manage. The goal, he said calmly, was guidance, helping the children separate what was real from what their minds insisted on showing them, without reinforcing the visions themselves. David listened, took it in, then asked the question that mattered. Why? The man removed his glasses and polished them slowly, each movement precise. He spoke of theories, of receptors and misfires, of inherited patterns and neurological explanations still being studied. But as he talked, David couldn't stop thinking about the green door and the sound that had been coming from behind it. He spoke next about patterns, how the children's visions overlapped with unsettling consistency. Different backgrounds, different histories, yet the same figures described again and again. To illustrate, he pulled another folder from the stack and turned it so David could see. A drawing. Crude figures filled the page, rendered in bright colors. Alongside them were shapes drawn faintly, barely there, as if the pencil had hesitated to commit. Those lighter forms looked unfinished, translucent. The visitors, the headmaster said evenly, that's what they call them. David suggested the obvious. Buildings held secrets. Old places trapped things, spores, gases, fields that interfered with perception. The man's jaw tightened just enough to notice. He responded with practiced patience, listing everything that had been tested and eliminated. No contamination, no leaks, no measurable interference. This wasn't the house, he insisted. This was the mind. He rose from his chair, the movement crisp, decisive. The meeting, it seemed, had ended well enough. There was only one thing left to do. Would David like to meet the children? They went down to the second floor through a doorway David could have sworn hadn't been there before. A common room opened up, dim, enclosed, quietly occupied. 6 children were scattered through the space. One perched by a window, 2 hunched over a table, crayons spread between them. 3 sat on a sagging couch, facing a dark television screen. They were different in every visible way. Different faces, different sizes, different postures. Yet something bound them together. A stillness, a listening quality, as if each of them were aware of something just beyond the walls. The headmaster introduced David and explained his role. His voice filled the room, calm and official. No one responded, not a word, not a nod. None of the children looked at the man speaking. Several looked at David. Their glances were brief, measuring. Then they looked away again, as though they'd confirmed what they already knew. At the table, a boy 9 maybe paused mid-stroke. His eyes lifted, not to David, but to the empty space beside him. His brow furrowed. Whatever he saw there unsettled him just enough that his hand stilled. He bent back over the page, but the crayon no longer moved. The girl by the window stared past David's shoulder, lips forming silent words meant for someone else. Cora sat alone, her chair tucked deep into the far corner, as distant from the television as possible. She watched David the way she had before, focused, careful, but now there was something urgent beneath it. When the headmaster turned toward the door, Cora's eyes flicked to the hallway, then back to David. She shook her head once, barely, a warning delivered too late to stop. The man stepped outside. David followed, pausing long enough to glance back. Cora had lowered her gaze to the book in her lap, but her shoulders were drawn tight. Her body braced the way people do when they sense what's coming and can't avoid it. As they climbed toward the 3rd floor again, the headmaster remarked on the children's quietness. New faces unsettled them, he said. Stress made them withdraw deeper into their perceptions. At the landing, he reached into his pocket and produced a key. The headmaster slipped the key from his pocket and placed it in David's hand. It barely had any weight to it, like it wasn't meant to last. He explained the layout with rehearsed ease. Staff quarters along the east wing. Meals served together. Attendance encouraged but never required. Sessions would begin the next morning, after the children completed their daily evaluations. David's room was the 2nd door on the left. His belongings would be brought up shortly. David stared at the key, then frowned. He mentioned he didn't have any bags. Had he left them in the car? The thought arrived half-formed, already unraveling. The headmaster didn't react. He simply nodded, said everything was in order, and invited David to join them for dinner at 7 before turning and walking away. The 2nd door opened easily. The room beyond it was scarcely more than a cell. A narrow bed pressed against one wall. A small desk bolted beneath a window that looked out onto the trees. No wardrobe, no drawers, nothing to unpack into, even if he had something to unpack. David sat on the bed and only then became aware of his clothes. He was still wearing what he'd arrived in. Jacket, shirt, slacks. the interview outfit, today's clothes. Today, the word felt unstable. He tried to trace the day backward. The drive, yes, that much was there. The road thinning, the signal dying, but before that, his apartment surfaced faintly like a photograph left too long in the sun. He could almost see it, but the details slipped whenever he reached for them. He was certain he'd packed a bag, or at least he remembered the idea of packing one. The memory thinned, dissolved, leaving nothing solid behind. Outside the window, evening had fallen too fast. The forest below had already darkened, even though the sky still clung to a pale, lifeless gray. In the clearing, 3 staff members in scrubs moved back and forth between the van and the building, carrying crates. David watched them absently, until something about their movement caught his attention. They lifted at the same moment, turned at the same moment, walked in perfect step like reflections sharing one body. Their motions were so precise they felt rehearsed, mechanical. No one spoke, no one looked up. A chill crawled up his spine. His stomach should have been empty. He tried to remember the last time he'd eaten. Nothing came, just blank space where memory should have lived. Morning felt impossibly distant, though he could still picture the light when he arrived. Time didn't move correctly here. He glanced at his watch. The face was empty, no hands, just smooth glass. He didn't remember it breaking. He didn't remember owning a watch like this. A bell rang below, clear, resonant. 6 o'clock. Children's dinner. David left his room and followed the sound downstairs, arriving at a dining room he would have sworn didn't exist earlier that day. A long table filled the space. 8 children sat evenly spaced along it. 2 staff members moved between them, placing plates, topping off water, their steps quiet and efficient. The children ate slowly, deliberately, each bite measured. No one spoke, and every so often one of them would pause, eyes lifting, heads turning slightly, watching something pass through the room that David could not see. Their focus drifted constantly, forks rising and falling, eyes tracking shapes that weren't there. The boy from earlier kept glancing at the empty chair beside him. Sometimes he nodded, as if agreeing. Other times he frowned, lips pressing thin in quiet resistance to a conversation only he could hear. David stayed near the doorway, watching. The staff moved around him, without acknowledgement. When one passed with a pitcher of water, she curved her path slightly, avoiding the space he occupied without ever looking at him. Instinctively, he stepped aside, then realized she'd already accounted for him. A moment later, the second staff member crossed the room toward the kitchen. David didn't move. She didn't slow. She didn't see him. She passed directly through the space where his shoulder was. The sensation hit all at once, sharp cold like plunging into winter water, layered with a buzzing hum that vibrated through his ribs. It wasn't pain, it was absence, a numb shock that lingered long enough to make his breath catch before fatting. He grabbed the doorframe, solid, real. He told himself it was exhaustion, grief, a mind stretched thin by unfamiliar surroundings. At the far end of the table, Cora hadn't touched her food. Her plate sat untouched as she watched the others eat. Her expression was one David recognized all too well, the look of someone who already knew the worst was coming and was bracing for it. Not sorrow yet, the moment before it. When the plates were cleared, the children stood and formed a line. Some hesitated in the doorway, heads tilting as though listening for instructions no one else could hear. Others cast wary glances into empty corners before leaving. Cora lingered until last. She stopped beside David, close enough that he felt her breath brush his sleeve. "They'll start the round soon," she whispered. "He should watch from the stairs." Before he could ask who she meant, she was gone. Down the hall, the television flicked on. Bright cartoon voices filled the common room, cheerful and misplaced. David checked his watch again, still blank. He climbed to the stair landing between floors, choosing a position where the hallway below lay open, but he remained unseen. At 7:30, the staff appeared, 4 of them now, 2 unfamiliar. They moved from room to room with clipboards and equipment, quiet and efficient. And then David saw it. They tilted their heads at the same angle while writing, reached for door handles with the same hand at the same moment. When one adjusted a child's IV, another, down the hall, mirrored the motion precisely. Not coordinated, synchronized, like one mind operating through several bodies. In another room, the same motion was repeated at the same instant, as if the house itself were cueing them. Through half-open doors, David watched bags replaced, monitors consulted, children examined with detached precision. The process was flawless, mechanical. No voices broke the rhythm. Only the soft rasp of pens, the muted beeping of machines, the whisper of fabric brushing fabric as the staff glided from room to room. The boy who had argued with empty air sat upright while a nurse checked his pulse. His mouth kept moving, shaping sentences meant for someone leaning close beside his pillow. The nurse never glanced in that direction. She marked something on her clipboard, adjusted the line in his arm, and stepped away, leaving the conversation unfinished. When they reached Cora's room, something shifted. The staff member inside stayed only a moment. Fewer measurements, fewer motions. Cora remained in her chair by the window, book open but unread, allowing the thermometer to touch her skin with the calm surrender of someone who knew it meant nothing. No notes were written, no data recorded. The woman left as if Cora required no watching at all, as if she were already accounted for. David didn't move until the last of them disappeared down the stairs. One by one, lights went out behind closed doors. By 8:30, the floor settled into an uneasy quiet, broken only by the creak of beds, a cough swallowed quickly, the faint murmur of voices too soft to understand. Back in his room, nothing had changed. Still no bags, no spare clothes, no toothbrush waiting in the bathroom he didn't remember inspecting. He lay down fully dressed and stared at the ceiling, where water stains spread like continents from a world no one had mapped. He didn't notice falling asleep. One moment he was tracing shapes overhead. The next, he was standing in the hallway outside his door. The third-floor corridor had stretched again, pulling itself long and narrow, doors lining the walls far beyond what the house should have held. At the far end stood a woman with her back to him, dark hair, slender shoulders. He knew her outline the way you know your own reflection. His feet made no sound as he approached. She didn't turn. She never did anymore, not in these dreams that refused to stay dreams. He tried to say her name, tried again. Nothing came out. When he reached for her shoulder, she dissolved. David jolted awake in his bed. Morning light pressed through the window, pale and cold, and for a moment he couldn't tell whether the night had ended or simply let him go. Against the glass, his fingers still spread, grasping for someone who was no longer there. Morning had arrived without ceremony. David pushed himself upright and realized nothing had changed. Same clothes, same shoes, the faint stiffness of having slept wrong. His mouth tasted sharp and metallic like old coins overheated in a pocket. Outside, daylight softened the forest, thinning the shadows, making the trees look almost normal, almost. The ones nearest the building stood too evenly spaced, their lines too deliberate, as if the woods had been arranged instead of grown. The van was gone. He went downstairs, guided by habit more than memory, searching for coffee. The dining room waited in silence. One place setting sat at the long table, precisely aligned. A metal carafe steamed beside a single cup. For him, he poured the coffee and sat facing the windows. The first sip burned his tongue but never reached his chest. No warmth followed. He drank anyway, watching dust spin lazily in the angled sunlight. Footsteps approached. Holloway appeared in the doorway, portfolio tucked under one arm. His gaze flicked to the table, to the cup, to David. Something crossed his face, recognition perhaps, but it vanished before settling into anything readable. He walked past without a word and continued toward his office. David called after him, asked about the day, the schedule, his first session. The footsteps kept climbing. The coffee had cooled by the time David noticed. He glanced at his watch again, still empty, no hands. He tried to remember pouring the drink, sitting down, lifting the cup. The memory slid away the moment he touched it. The smell of bacon drew him to the kitchen. Two staff members stood at the counter assembling breakfast trays. They moved in perfect rhythm. One reached for bacon as the other reached for toast. Plates slid forward at the same instant. Covers lowered together. No wasted motion. No hesitation. David spoke, asked questions, introduced himself again. They didn't respond. A cart was loaded and pushed toward the door. David stepped aside automatically. The staff member passed through the space he'd occupied, as if it were empty air. He followed. On the second floor, trays were distributed with quiet efficiency. Polite murmurs followed, soft thank yous, lowered eyes. When the cart reached Cora, she didn't touch the food. She stared at the plate as though it had accused her of something. The staff member didn't wait. She set the tray down and moved on. When the footsteps faded, Cora finally looked up. Her eyes met David's across the room, steady and unblinking. She didn't smile, she didn't speak. But the message was unmistakable. This wasn't breakfast. It was a countdown. She lifted her head and locked eyes with him. Her lips shaped two words. Not real. Something inside David shifted, whether loosening or cinching tight, he couldn't tell. He stepped closer and asked her what she meant, but she had already turned away, gazing out the window. Morning light caught the IV line and made it glow unnaturally bright, like strands of glass. Her lips moved again, silently counting. Whatever number she was tracking, she didn't want him to hear it. The rest of the morning fractured. David tried to find Holloway. The office door was locked. From behind the green door down the hall came that same patterned sound, tap, pause, tap, stronger now, impatient, like something pressing outward. Staff members slid past David when he attempted conversation, their replies non-existent or evasive, as though his words hadn't landed anywhere solid. He wandered the corridors, jotting notes for sessions that never appeared on any schedule, watching children who seemed to register him only at the edges of their vision. A flicker, a hesitation, the way you sense a draft before feeling air. At some point, he meant to return to his room. Instead, he found himself on the second floor. Cora's door passed on his right. He turned a corner he didn't remember existing, and the hallway stretched on, identical to the one behind him. Same doors, same lighting, same silence. He walked until his feet ached and ended up exactly where he'd started. Cora's door again. He tried once more, counting each step. The hallway bent without bending, looped without turning, delivering him back to the same place. Direction stopped mattering. Distance lost meaning. The house held its shape, but space itself had stopped listening. By noon, 3 pages filled a notebook he didn't remember owning. His observations grew less coherent the longer he wrote them. The children spoke more earnestly to nothing than to anyone present. The staff navigated around him the way people avoid furniture left in familiar places. In the bathroom, his reflection looked wrong, washed out, dim, like a photocopy made too many times. The room behind him was sharp and detailed, only he seemed to be fatting. He realized he was standing outside Cora's room again, without recalling how he'd arrived. She sat in her chair, book open, eyes sliding over the page without following the lines. When he tapped on the doorframe, she looked up with a face he knew well, the expression of someone who had waited for terrible news and had finally stopped hoping it wouldn't come. "You're starting to see it," she said. David stepped inside. She didn't protest. He sat on the edge of her bed, careful around the equipment that felt more ornamental than necessary. The IV bag hung at the same level it had before. Or maybe it always had. He stared at it, trying to remember if it had ever changed at all. Remembered checking. He asked her directly, his voice tight, trembling even though he tried to steady it. "What's happening here? What's wrong with this place? What did you mean by not real?" Cora closed her book, Watership down. David noted the title, murmuring it softly while leaning against the windowsill. She looked at him then, her gaze ancient and knowing, far beyond her 10-year-old face. "The others," she said, "see people who aren't here anymore, but I see you." The words fell like stones. David waited for context, for an explanation that would make sense, for some bridge from this child's certainty to his own logic, but none came. She stood and moved to the window, pressing her small palm against the glass. Outside, a bird landed on the sill, a crow. Its feathers shimmered with oily light. It cocked its head not at her but at him. Its eyes held the precise, careful focus of recognition, of something acknowledging its own. "They tell me I'm sick," she said quietly, almost to herself, "like the others, that I see things that aren't there, but I'm not sick. I'm my father's daughter." She turned, and in the soft light her skin seemed almost translucent, fragile as porcelain. David could make out the faint contours beneath, the shapes of bone under skin. "This is a hospice, Mr. Crane," she continued. "These children, they're dying. That's why they see what they see. The boundary gets thin, but I'm not dying. I was born this way." David's throat tightened. Words failed him. He managed only a whisper. "That's not possible. You've been here almost 24 hours. Have you slept? Change your clothes," she asked, her voice calm, piercing. He looked down at his hands. The wedding ring caught the light. Beneath it, his skin seemed pale, off its texture wrong. He tried to remember the last time he'd felt hunger, thirst, the urge for anything, and the memories refused to form. Coffee. He'd had it this morning, hadn't he? But it had burned his tongue without heat, tasted hollow, as if he'd drunk the memory of it rather than the drink itself. "The others," Cora said, voice low, "see their families. The people they love, the ones who have already crossed. They think it's hallucination because that's what my father tells them. But they're really there, Mr. Crane, waiting." Her tone softened, almost tender now. "Your wife has been here since you arrived. She sits in the chair beside your bed. I see her when I pass your room at night." The floor shifted beneath him. David gripped the edge of the bed for support, but his hand sank through the mattress as though it were air. No resistance. Nothing but a humming, icy void that crept up his arm, buzzing like television static. He yanked his hand back, staring at his palm. It looked normal. It felt normal. But the memory of that empty, frozen space crawled up his forearm like frost. "I don't understand," he said, his words hollow, distant, as though they'd been spoken from somewhere far away. Cora tilted her head, eyes steady, unwavering. She went back to her chair and hugged the book to her chest, gripping it like armor. "The accident on Route 80, she said softly. "You were driving." The memories didn't arrive all at once. They broke through in shards, rain streaking the windshield. Catherine's voice beside him, half lost beneath the sound of tires on wet asphalt. Headlights drifting into the wrong lane, too close, too fast. The instant of knowing there was no room left to escape. No time. The impact felt like the end of everything because, for him, it was. "You both died," Cora said. Catherine crossed right away. She hesitated, searching for words that could hold what came next. But sometimes people don't know, or they know but they can't accept it. They get stuck looking for what they lost or for a place they think they still belong. David rose to his feet. His legs moved, but they carried no weight, like they weren't fully attached to the floor. The bathroom was only a few steps away. He crossed the distance without choosing to, pulled by a need so sharp it felt physical. He had to see, had to prove her wrong. The mirror above the sink was clean, unclouded. For a moment everything looked fine. His face older, hollowed by grief, but unmistakably his. His clothes, the ring on his finger. Then the image flickered. Just once, and he was gone. The mirror reflected only the room behind him, the shower curtain, the towel rack, the window, the space where he should have been showed nothing at all, as if no one had ever stood there. David clutched the sink. The porcelain felt solid beneath his hands, real, but when he looked down, he could see it through his fingers. White curves visible through skin that had thinned to something gauzy, translucent, fatting like ink left too long in sunlight. The reflection returned. He stared at the man in the mirror and saw what was wrong now. The shadows didn't fall correctly. The edges of his shape blurred, slightly out of focus. He looked less like a presence and more like something projected onto the glass. The memories rushed in behind the realization. The narrowing roads, the dead GPS, coordinates leading to a place that shouldn't exist, doors left open, rooms unlocked. The way he drifted through the house, unnoticed, untouched. 8 children seeing the dead because they were close to death. One girl seeing the dead because she'd been born able to. "This isn't real," he said, though the words felt thin even as he spoke them. "It is," Cora corrected gently from the doorway, "just not in the way you think." She watched him with quiet certainty. "My father built this place for children like me. Children who needed to understand that what they see isn't a curse, and for children who need comfort at the end." Her gaze softened. "You found it because you were searching, not for a job, for somewhere to land." She stepped back, giving him space to breathe, if breathing was still something he needed. "The dead don't always know they're dead," she said. "Sometimes they need help too." She retreated to her chair and clutched Watership, down to her chest like a shield. "The accident on Route 80, she said softly. "Months ago, you were driving." The memories came apart, instead of returning whole. Rain streaking across the windshield. Catherine's voice, half heard, half lost. Headlights drifting into the wrong lane, too close, too fast. That split second of understanding, there was no room left to move. The impact didn't feel like pain. It felt like the end of the world because it was his world, their world. "You both died," the girl said gently. Catherine crossed over immediately. "But you," she hesitated, searching for words that wouldn't break him. "Sometimes people don't realize they're gone, or they realize but can't accept it. They get stuck between what they lost and where they belong." David stood. His legs moved, but they felt disconnected, weightless, as if the floor had forgotten him. The bathroom was 3 steps away. He crossed them without choosing to, driven by a desperate need to see, to confirm, to disprove her. The mirror above the sink was clean and clear. At first, everything looked normal. His face older, exhausted, but unmistakably his. The jacket, the shirt, the wedding ring. Then the reflection flickered. Just once, just a heartbeat. And vanished. The mirror showed only the bathroom behind him. Shower curtain, towel rack, window. Empty space where a man had been standing seconds before. David grabbed the sink. It felt solid, real. But when he looked down, he could see porcelain through his fingers, as if his body were thinning, unraveling, fading like an old photograph left too long in the sun. The reflection snapped back. He stared at the man in the glass and knew something was wrong. The shadows didn't sit right. The edges of his body blurred, as if he were a projection instead of a presence. He thought of the drive here, the narrowing roads, the GPS coordinates that led to a place no map acknowledged, the unlocked doors, the way he drifted through the building like smoke. 8 children who could see the dead because they were dying. And 1 girl who could see them because she'd been born that way. "This isn't real," he whispered. "It is," Cora said from the doorway. "Just not in the way you think." She stepped closer, careful, as if approaching a wounded animal. "My father built this place for children like me," she said. "Children who needed to understand their gift wasn't a curse. And children who needed comfort in their final days. You found it because you needed somewhere to go," she continued. "The dead are drawn to thin places and to people who can see them. I'm sorry," she added quietly. "I've been trying to tell you since you arrived. You just weren't ready." David backed away from the mirror. His hand passed straight through the towel rack. No resistance, no substance. Only a violent cold buzzing through him like his atoms were screaming. His clothes were wrong. No wrinkles, no wear, no sign of a day lived in them. They were exactly as they'd been at the moment of impact. The jacket, the shirt, the slacks he died in. He fled. Down the stairs, past the first floor, further into a staircase he didn't remember seeing. The basement smelled of damp earth and standing water. The walls were stone, older than the house above, as if the building had been raised on the bones of something forgotten. In the corner were boxes labeled with names and dates. Patient records. The handwriting was strange, the dates impossibly old. Inside one box were photographs. Children in outdated clothes stood before the building when it was new, when the forest hadn't yet closed in around it. On the porch stood a woman in a long dress. Beside her, a man in a suit. Between them, a small girl. Cora. The date on the back read 1987. 39 years ago. Unless she'd been born then. Unless she'd lived here her entire life. Unless time behaved differently for those born between worlds. When he returned upstairs, the house had changed again. Daylight had bled away into the gray hush before dusk. Outside, the children moved through rehearsed routines, supervised by staff who checked watches, made notes, and gently guided them back inside as the light failed. David returned to his room. It was exactly as he'd left it, except for the woman sitting by the window. She wore the blue sweater he'd given her for her birthday, the one she'd been wearing in the car. Her hair fell across her face the way it always did when she slept. She didn't look up. He approached slowly, terrified she would disappear. She didn't. She was solid, present, more real than anything else in the house had ever been. He knelt beside the chair, reaching for her hand, and felt nothing. His fingers passed through hers as if through water, two currents that would never merge. Then she turned fully to him and her eyes met his. No shock, no disbelief, only recognition. Catherine smiled, sad, knowing, patient beyond measure. She had been waiting for him to understand. "I'm sorry," he whispered, the words ragged, broken. "I'm sorry I didn't save us." She shook her head, gentle, deliberate. Her lips moved, forming words he felt more than heard. "It wasn't your fault. It was never your fault." Time unraveled. They sat together in silence, bodies unable to touch, yet sharing a space deeper than touch could measure. Outside, stars emerged in strange constellations he didn't know. The woods had swallowed the day, but the house glowed, each window like a living cell in a massive, breathing organism. Eventually, Catherine rose. She moved toward the doorway with the fluid grace he remembered, barefoot mornings, quiet steps to the kitchen. At the threshold, she paused, turning to him, hand extended as an invitation. David tried to rise, but his body refused. The weight of his own presence kept him anchored. Fear gripped him, fear of letting go, of accepting what Cora had shown him, of surrendering to the reality he hadn't known he was missing. Catherine waited, patient as always. A knock at the door broke the moment. Cora stood there, small, solemn, striped pajamas hanging straight on her frame. She looked at Catherine, not through her, not past her, but at her as if acknowledging what had always been. "She's been very patient," Cora said softly, "but she can't wait forever. None of them can." David looked from his wife to Cora, then down at his own hands, which were beginning to take on a translucent glow in the lamplight. He thought of the children downstairs, seeing their families one last time, receiving comfort in transitions they couldn't yet understand. He thought of Holloway, creating a place where death could be met with care, gentleness, guidance. He thought of the thinness of the boundary between life and absence, how little it took to cross. "What happens if I go with her?" he asked. Cora's expression softened. "You stop being lost." Catherine's hand remained outstretched. Beyond her, figures began to materialize in the hallway, first translucent, then solidifying as his perception adjusted. People in all states of life and death. An elderly woman in a hospital gown, her skin like fragile parchment. A teenage boy, face intact, skull hinting at its fragility beneath. A man worn and familiar, yet faded. They lingered, waiting for recognition, for the gentle crossing, for someone to meet them on the threshold. The air pulsed with something unnameable, sacred and terrible all at once. David's breath caught. His fear, his grief, his disbelief. They all balanced on the edge of a choice he now understood he had to make. Catherine's hand didn't waver. The invitation waited. And he knew he could step forward, or remain lost forever. David saw it all now, the fragile edge between life and what comes after. Through the boy's head he glimpsed the shattered bone, crushed beyond imagining. A man's chest opened like a book, the cavity where his heart once beat laid bare. In the same instant he saw them die. The woman's face contorted in agony, the boy's mouth frozen in a silent scream, the man grasping at the emptiness inside him. Then, as if mercy intervened, their features softened. Wounds closed, the horror fading, but the truth remained. The dead who could not accept their passing were trapped, doomed to relive their final moments over and over. Catherine's hand remained steady beside him. She had crossed cleanly, accepted the impossible, and now she offered him the same release. Among the other figures, David noticed the boy from the coloring table conversing with an elderly woman, his grandmother long gone. The girl at the window seat held hands with a version of herself, or perhaps a sister lost to time. 8 children moved among the dead with ease, like people who had never truly been apart from them. Holloway stood at the far end of the hall, watching his daughter with an expression that balanced loss and love, not as headmaster, but as a father who had built a sanctuary for dying children so his own daughter could see death without fear. Cora met his gaze and nodded once, absolution, or perhaps permission. Holloway turned and descended, leaving the living to their routines below. "It's easier if you don't fight it, Cora," a voice whispered. "Take her hand. Let her guide you forward." David looked at Catherine, really looked for the first time since the accident. Patience, unwavering love. And certainty shone in her eyes. Wherever she was going, she wanted him there. He remembered the life they had, the stolen years, the shared laughter, the future ripped away in a flash of rain and headlights. He thought of how he had longed to save her, to rewrite the impossible physics of impact. But some things could not be undone. Some losses demanded surrender. He reached for her hand and felt the nothing of it, then felt everything, a connection that transcended touch, a recognition that their existence stretched beyond flesh and bone. The room began to dissolve around him, the edges of the world softening, the air pulsing with something ancient and inevitable. And he understood it was time. Perhaps it was David who was fatting now, releasing the final threads that had tied him to a world he no longer belonged to. The figures around him stepped aside, faces serene, whole, offering silent recognition. At the top of the stairs, Catherine paused and glanced back at Cora, mouthing a single, heartfelt thank you. Cora lifted her hand in return, standing long after they had descended, long after the hallway had emptied of everything but the living. Below, the house exhaled its nightly rhythm, staff checking vitals, children settling into their sleep, the building breathing quietly with care and routine. By morning, Holloway would note a slight draft in the third-floor storage room, as if a door left open all night had finally shut. The children would remark that the man in the interview clothes no longer wandered the common room, no longer lingered in doorways with confused eyes. The staff would find the dining room cup, washed and replaced, a quiet trace of a presence that had let go. And Cora would return to her window seat, watership down open in her lap, vigilantly watching over children whose time was measured in fleeting days, not years. She would watch the woods, waiting for the next lost soul drawn to Mercy House, a place where grief and need could guide the living and the dead to speak the same language. The crow on the windowsill tilted its head once, then vanished into the night, carrying the last shimmer of David Crane's presence. In the clearing below, the woods whispered their secrets. The house settled into its foundations. 8 children dreamed of the loved ones who waited for them. And on the 3rd floor, a single chair caught the moonlight empty, yet holding the memory of 2 souls who had finally found their way home. Story 2, All the Time in the World. The fluorescent light above the nurse's station flickered in a pattern that felt deliberate. Counted. 1, 2, 3. Pause. 1, 2, 3. Pause. Laura had been watching it for what felt like an hour. The clock on the wall, A school clock with thick black numbers and a red second hand had not moved since the moment she noticed it. Willowbrook assisted living smelled of lavender, heavy and deliberate, layered over something older and less kind. The lavender wasn't there to soothe, it was there to hide. Laura pressed her palms flat against the laminate counter and tried to remember parking her car. The thought arrived with the sharp clarity of a dream realization, the sudden certainty that something important had been skipped, like realizing you're naked at a party, like remembering the exam is today and you never studied. She could remember the morning clearly. Her cat winding around her ankles as she packed her bag. The coffee from the gas station on Broad Street, still warm in the cup holder. The phone interview. The woman's voice, crackled, distant, old in a way that didn't belong to age alone. The salary, surprisingly generous for a night shift at a Medicaid facility buried in farmland. But the drive itself, nothing. No highway exit. No county road. No gravel approach cutting through fields gone wild. Just blank space. She tried to remember the taste of the coffee and found only lavender flooding the memory where it should have been. You're tired, she told herself. Night nurses were always tired, bone-deep tired, the kind that blurred time and thinned reality until hours slid by in a waking sleep. The light flickered again. 1, 2, 3. Pause. Laura turned and walked down the east corridor because standing still made the building feel heavier. Willowbrook had been designed to look like a home, not an institution. Wall sconces shaped like candle flames. Wallpaper patterned with pale roses. Crown molding repainted so many times its details had softened into suggestion. But the proportions were wrong. The hallway was too long. The ceiling subtly rose and fell as she walked, as if the building had been constructed by someone recreating a place from memory instead of blueprints. Room 14 stood with its door propped open by a rubber wedge. Inside, a woman sat in a wheelchair facing the window. There was nothing outside the window, only darkness, only the room reflected back at itself. Her hair was thin and white, scalp showing through like stone beneath shallow water. Her hands gripped the wheelchair arms tightly, fingers curled with the quiet intensity of someone holding on. The placard read, Mrs. Hendricks. Laura stepped inside, ready to offer help with bedtime preparations. Simple kindness, routine, the reason she was here. Mrs. Hendricks didn't turn. He'll be coming up the drive any minute now, she said softly. I told him I'd wait. Laura swallowed. The driveway, she knew, was half a mile long and visible from no window in the building. Yet the woman's grip tight, knuckles pale, eyes fixed on the glass as if she could already see headlights cutting through the dark. And Laura, standing behind her, felt a strange certainty settle in her chest. Whatever Mrs. Hendricks was waiting for had been a long time coming. The chart hanging on the back of the door told a different story. Leonard Hendricks died in 1987. Heart attack at work. The kind of death that interrupts a sentence. One moment you're planning dinner, the next you're gone. He'd gone out to get the car checked. A clicking noise, something minor. He never came back. Mrs. Hendricks had been a resident of Willowbrook for 19 months. She continued staring at the window, watching a driveway that could not be seen from anywhere in the building. Laura lingered in the doorway, watching the woman's grip tighten around the armrests, noticing how the lavender smell thickened, grew heavier, as though whatever it was meant to cover had begun to rise. The night shift at Willowbrook consisted of 4 people, including Laura, though she couldn't quite remember the orientation where she'd learned their names. There was Donna, her gray hair braided down her back to her waist, hands steady in practice. There was Webb, thin and quiet, moving through corridors with the careful silence of someone who had learned not to wake sleepers, or something else. And there was Perline, the supervisor. Perline was old in the way buildings are old. Not measured in years, but in accumulation, in layers. When she stood in certain light, the skin of her hands looked faintly translucent, as if Laura could see the pale geometry of bone beneath, shapes that didn't quite match how hands were supposed to be arranged. At precisely 2:00 a.m., they gathered at the nurse's station. "Comfort rounds," Donna said, as though nomming a tradition older than policy. They moved through the facility in a quiet procession that felt less like work and more like ritual. Webb carried a ceramic bowl filled with dried herbs, sage, and something sweeter beneath it, something that burned with a smell like a church basement in August. Donna carried a cotton bag filled with small objects that clinked softly when she walked. Perline led the way, humming. The tune was familiar in the way childhood songs are familiar, not remembered but known. It moved in 3/4 time, a waltz rhythm. No one danced. Webb and Donna joined the humming as they walked, their voices slipping into harmony with the ease of long practice. Laura felt her own throat vibrate with the melody before she consciously chose to join in. They stopped outside room 7. Inside, Earl Comstock slept with his mouth open, hands folded neatly across his chest in the posture of someone already laid out. Perline nodded once. Donna opened her cotton bag and removed a small cloth bundle tied with red thread. She placed it gently on Earl's bedside table. And Laura understood, without anyone explaining, that this was not about comfort for the living. It was about keeping something else at bay. Donna slid the bundle beneath Earl Comstock's pillow with the careful tenderness of someone tucking in a child. Webb lifted the ceramic bowl and moved it in slow, deliberate circles. The smoke spilled downward, settling over the bed like a second blanket. Perline's humming softened, thinned, and then stopped entirely. She bent close to Earl's ear and whispered. The words were not English, or perhaps they were once. They had the shape of language, the familiar rise and fall of speech worn smooth by generations of repetition. Meaning sanded away until only sound remained. Laura caught fragments as they passed through her. Stay, settle, keep. Something that might have been home, or hold. Earl did not wake, but his breathing changed. It had been shallow before, the careful, measured breath of sedation. Now it deepened, slowed, found a rhythm. His lungs fell into step with the melody that had guided them there, as if they had learned the song long ago and only needed reminding. They moved on. Room after room, bed after bed. At each stop the same ritual unfolded. The bundle beneath the pillow, the slow circling smoke, the whispered words. Some residents stirred. Some opened their eyes and stared at the ceiling without seeing it. Others smiled faintly as though recognizing a voice they once loved. Mrs. Hendricks remained in her wheelchair by the window when they reached her room. She accepted the smoke and the words without acknowledgement, still waiting, still watching the darkness for headlights that would never come. Laura performed her role without ever being told what it was. She held the cotton bag while Donna retrieved the bundles. She counted the circles Webb traced with the bowl, always 7, never 6, never 8. She listened as Pearline spoke and felt the words settle into her chest like stones sinking into deep water. This was not standard care. It was not written in any manual, taught in any nursing program, or approved by any licensing board. In 15 years of night shifts, Laura had never encountered anything like it. And yet, after the rounds, the residents breathed easier. The building itself seemed to exhale, corridors shortened, ceilings settled. The lavender smell thinned, faded, and whatever lurked beneath it retreated, slipping back into sleep. Laura tried to remember her apartment in Columbus. She knew she had won. The knowledge was solid, factual, unquestionable. But when she tried to picture the kitchen, she saw Willowbrook instead. The industrial stove, the dented refrigerator, the calendar on the wall showing a covered bridge in autumn. October, though October had surely passed. When she tried to picture her bedroom, she saw room 22. A narrow bed, a window facing nothing, a nightstand that hummed softly like it was keeping time. She stopped trying after that, because the effort made her feel tired in a way sleep could not fix. And somewhere deep in the building, beneath the lavender and the rituals and the careful hands, something shifted again, listening, counting, waiting for the moment it would be needed once more. Was empty. Room 22 was always empty. A bed neatly made with white sheets, tucked tight as if waiting for someone who had promised to arrive and never quite managed it. Laura stood in the doorway without remembering how she'd gotten there. One moment she had been at the nurse's station, logging vitals. The next, she was here. The door was open. The bed was perfect. The window reflected darkness in her. Except the woman in the glass was not wearing scrubs. Her reflection wore a white blouse and dark slacks, interview clothes, funeral clothes, the kind chosen carefully, deliberately for moments that mattered. Laura stepped back. Her reflection did not. It lingered a heartbeat longer at the window, watching her with an expression Laura could not name. Then slowly, it stepped backward into the darkness that was not darkness at all, only the absence of light, and disappeared. Lara closed the door. She did not mention this to the other staff. She did not mention the missing memories, the drive she could not reconstruct, the apartment she could not picture, the room that seemed to be waiting specifically for her. Night nurses learned early what not to talk about. The sounds without sources, the movements at the edges of vision, the feeling that the sleeping patients were not entirely asleep and not entirely patients. These were the ordinary strangeness of night work. To speak of them was to admit that they were not ordinary at all. So Laura worked. She checked vitals and recorded numbers that did not change. She distributed medications in small paper cups to mouths that opened on reflex. She answered call buttons that rang from rooms where the occupants could not have pressed them. Unable to move, unable to wake, unable to do anything but lie still and breathe. And now, with a clarity that felt less like realization and more like remembering, Laura understood they were being kept, held in place by rhythm and ritual, taught how to stay. By the third night, or what she counted as the third, though counting had become unreliable, she noticed the inconsistencies. Mrs. Hendricks' chart listed her stay as 19 months, but Mrs. Hendricks spoke of waiting for Leonard with the patience of decades, and the staff treated her waiting as a fixed feature of Willowbrook, as permanent as the wallpaper, as natural as the corridors that were always a little too long. Mr. Comstock in room 7 had an admission date from March of the current year, but the year itself slipped in Laura's mind. Was it 2019, 2023, something in between? Something after? Mr. Comstock's face had the settled look of someone who had been lying in the same position for years, flesh molded to bone, time pressing down until the body adapted. On what might have been her 4th night, or her 14th, Laura walked to the basement door. It was at the end of the west corridor, beyond the rooms no one ever rang from, past a stretch of wall that smelled faintly of damp earth. The door had no window, no placard, just a handle worn smooth by use. It was locked, but when Laura rested her hand against the wood, she felt something on the other side. Not movement. Weight, as though the building itself leaned back. And for the first time since she'd arrived at Willowbrook, the fluorescent light stopped flickering. They held steady, as if the counting had paused, just long enough to see whether she would try the handle again. None of that happened. Webb arrived with a gurney that Laura did not remember seeing stored anywhere. Its wheels did not squeak. Its metal frame bore no scratches, no dents, no evidence of use, as if it had always existed in exactly this state and never needed to be moved before now. Together, they transferred Mr. Comstock's body with practiced ease. He was lighter than Laura expected. Not the lightness of muscle loss or age, but something else, an absence where weight should have been. They wheeled him down the west corridor. The lights dimmed ahead of them and brightened behind, as if the building were making room. The cold room door opened when Pearline approached it, though Laura never saw her use a key. Inside, the temperature dropped instantly, breath blooming white in the air. Stainless steel shelves lined the walls, each holding a covered form. Not many, fewer than a facility of this size should require. The air smelled of metal and frost and something faintly sweet, like flowers left too long in water. They slid Mr. Comstock onto an empty shelf. Pearline drew the sheet up over his face, paused, then leaned close and spoke the same worn smooth words Laura had heard during comfort rounds. Stay, settle, rest. The sound slid into the cold like stones into deep water. Only then did Laura notice the tags. Each body bore a tag, tied to the wrist with red thread. Not names. Dates. Arrival dates. Some were recent, some were decades old. Laura's chest tightened as she scanned them. The oldest tag she could see read October 14, 1989. The newest, on the shelf beside Mr. Comstock, read October and then nothing. The ink trailed off unfinished. Why aren't they being taken? Laura asked before she could stop herself. Pearline turned slowly. In the cold light, her face looked thinner, her eyes deeper, as if the years had been compressed into her rather than layered. Taken where? She asked gently. To the funeral home, Laura said. To their families. Pearline smiled, not kindly, not cruelly, patiently. They're not finished yet. That night, or what passed for night, Laura dreamed while standing. She dreamed of lying in a narrow bed, unable to move, listening to humming through the walls. She dreamed of corridors stretching longer each time she tried to reach the end. She dreamed of waiting for someone who had promised to come back, headlights appearing at the far end of a drive that never ended. She woke or became aware, at the nurse's station, her hands resting on the laminate counter, the fluorescent light flickering. 1, 2, 3, pause. The clock still hadn't moved. By the next cycle, Mrs. Hendricks stopped speaking of Leonard in future tense. He should be here by now, she said instead. By the cycle after that, She stopped speaking at all. Laura found her sitting in her wheelchair, hands folded neatly in her lap, eyes closed as if listening to something far away. Her chest rose and fell, but slowly, with effort, as though each breath required permission. That was when Laura understood. The comfort rounds were not to soothe the living. They were to teach the dying how to stay, how to wait, how to linger without crossing fully over. Willowbrook was not an assisted living facility. It was a holding place, a buffer, a pause. Laura returned to room 22. This time, the bed was not empty. A woman lay there wearing a white blouse and dark slacks. Her hair was neatly brushed. Her hands were folded across her chest in a posture Laura recognized instantly. It was her, or close enough. The woman opened her eyes. "You're early," she said softly. Laura stepped back, heart pounding. "I don't understand." The woman smiled with tired familiarity. "You never do at first." Memory flooded in all at once. The drive through the fields, the headlights that drifted across the center line, the sound of metal folding, the moment of weightlessness before pain or before nothing. "You died on the way here," the woman said gently, "but you weren't ready to leave, and they needed someone like you." Laura thought of the residents, of Mr. Comstock, of Mrs. Hendricks waiting decade after decade, of the cold room shelves with their unfinished dates. "I helped them," Laura whispered. "Yes," the woman said, "you help them stay. And when they're ready." The woman glanced toward the door where faint humming drifted in, 3-4 times, steady and endless. "Then they go." Laura felt the building breathe around her. The lavender scent deepened, then softened. The light flickered. 1, 2, 3, pause. When Laura returned to the nurse's station, Pearline was waiting. "You can leave whenever you want," Pearline said, "but most don't." Laura looked down at her hands. They were thinner than she remembered, slightly translucent at the edges. She thought of Columbus, of an apartment she could not picture, of a life that had ended without asking permission. "I'll stay," she said. Pearline nodded, satisfied. The clock ticked. For the first time, the red second hand moved. And somewhere deep beneath Willowbrook, the cold room waited, patient and full of time. The corridors bent where corridors shouldn't bend, stretched longer than the building allowed, as if the structure itself refused to obey measurements. The calendar on the wall still read October. It had read October every time Laura checked. People outside this place were not involved. They couldn't be. Whatever governed this building did not extend beyond its walls. Laura nodded. Nodding was easier than asking. The questions pressing against her mind had no language yet, only shapes, heavy and wordless. She helped web wrap Mr. Comstock in a clean sheet. The fabric felt heavier than cotton should. Together, they carried him down the west corridor, past the laundry room that reeked of bleach and heat, past the supply closet where unmarked boxes of cotton sat like forgotten offerings. Pearline stopped at the basement door. From somewhere, Laura couldn't tell where, Pearline produced a key, not from a pocket, not from a lanyard. It simply appeared. The lock turned with a sound that felt older than metal. The stairs descended into concrete worn smooth by decades of footsteps. Halfway down, the cold reached Laura. This wasn't the cold of refrigeration. It had weight, purpose. Her breath didn't fog. This cold didn't care about air or lungs. It was the cold of deep water, of caves untouched by sun, of places warmth had never been invited into. The cold room was too large, far too large for the basement of a facility this size. Gurneys lined the walls. On them lay shapes beneath white sheets. Laura counted 7 before she stopped, before understanding that counting was a mistake. These weren't bodies waiting for transport. They were being kept. Webb and Perline placed Mr. Kumtak onto an empty gurney. Perline began to hum, a low, rhythmic sound. Webb joined in, their voices blending until the room seemed to hum back. The sound suggested hollow walls, suggested distance, suggested that this room did not end where Laura's eyes stopped, that beneath the building were more rooms, rooms inside rooms, cold spaces folded inward like Russian dolls. One of the shapes moved, just a twitch, a subtle shift beneath the sheet. But Laura saw it and understood. These bodies were not dead, the way bodies were meant to be dead. They were waiting, held at a threshold they had not been allowed to cross. Perline stopped humming and opened her eyes. "He'll need 3 days," she said to Webb, though her gaze never left Laura. 3 days for the settling, then he can come back upstairs. The nearest sheet slipped. Just enough. Laura saw the face. Mrs. Gable, room 12. Her chart said she'd been discharged to family care 2 weeks ago. Mrs. Gable's eyes were open and waiting. Mrs. Gable's eyes were open, staring at nothing and somehow at everything. Her lips moved, carefully shaping words that never crossed into sound. Laura climbed the stairs without being told. She walked the west corridor without feeling the linoleum beneath her feet. She stood at the nurse's station and watched the clock that did not move, and the understanding came to her all at once, clean and absolute, like a sudden drop. She had been at Willowbrook far longer than 3 nights, longer than 14, longer than any number she could still hold onto. The first time Laura saw one of the residents from the cold room walking the halls again, she told herself she was mistaken. Memory failed, faces blurred, time rearranged itself when you weren't watching. Mrs. Gable from room 12 had thin white hair and a face shaped by decades of gravity. She could have been anyone, any elderly woman Laura had ever cared for. But Mrs. Gable walked with a particular gait, a soft shuffle that favored her left hip. And when she passed Laura in the corridor, she smelled not of lavender, but of what lay beneath it. Something that had risen. The returned residents were not the same as before. This was obvious, and yet not. Visible, but deniable. The kind of wrongness that could be dismissed by anyone determined not to see it. Mrs. Gable's eyes tracked movement a half-second too late. Mr. Kumtak, when he returned to room 7 after his 3 days in the basement, answered questions about his comfort, his breakfast, his need for extra blankets. But each response arrived after a pause that lingered just a moment too long, as if the words had traveled a great distance to reach him. They did not remember dying. Or rather, they remembered everything except dying. They recalled the moment before. They recalled the moment after, but the crossing itself was gone. Mrs. Gable spoke of her room, her window, her daughter who visited every Sunday, though no visitors had come to Willowbrook since Laura arrived. Mr. Kumtak asked for the newspaper so he could check the weather. The paper Donna brought him was dated October. October had passed. It had to have passed. Laura watched them the way one watches a familiar word written too many times, until it stops meaning what it once did, until the letters loosen, drift apart, and reform into shapes that only resemble language. The returned residents ate breakfast in the dining room that smelled of powdered eggs and lavender. They sat in the common room and watched. The television programs moved too quickly for their eyes to follow. They submitted to the comfort rounds each night. They accepted the bundles, the smoke, the words. Their breathing fell into step with the humming, and they did not die again. That was the purpose of the rituals. Laura understood it now, without anyone needing to explain. Willowbrook was not preventing death. It was refusing to let death finish. They held the residents at the threshold, kept the door open, reached back, pulled them away from the settling that should have followed. The settling that meant staying dead. The settling that meant ending. The residents did not seem unhappy. This was the worst part. Mrs. Hendricks still waited by her window for Leonard, but her waiting had softened. It held a peace to it now, a patience that would never be exhausted because time itself no longer moved for her. Mr. Kumtak read his October newspaper every morning as though it were new, because for him it was new. It would always be new. The weather report always promised a mild weekend and a chance of evening showers. They existed inside loops. Laura saw it most clearly in Mrs. Atrix, who spoke the same words about Leonard and the clicking noise in the car at precisely the same hour each night. She performed her waiting the way one performs a scene, faithfully, endlessly. But all the returned residents had their loops, the same gestures, the same phrases, the same moments of looking at nothing and looking at everything, repeated and repeated until repetition became invisible, until it became ordinary, until it became how things were supposed to be. Laura tried to remember her own loops. She woke each evening in a room she did not remember entering, changed into scrubs she did not remember putting on, walked to the nurse's station along a corridor whose length she no longer questioned. She performed her duties, the vitals, the medications, the call buttons, and she performed the comfort rounds. And somewhere between the humming and the smoke and the words, she forgot to wonder when she had learned the tune, forgot to question why her throat vibrated with harmonies no one had taught her. Her phone was not in her pocket. She noticed this on a night that felt like waking from a dream, a night when the fluorescent lights flickered in the wrong rhythm, 1, 2, 3, 4 instead of 1, 2, 3. The wrongness of the count made her reach for her phone to check the time. Her pocket was empty. All of her pockets were empty. No phone, no wallet, no car keys, no identification of any kind. She was wearing scrubs without a name badge, standing in a building whose location. She could not place it on any map. She could not name the road that should have led to it. She cared for patients who did not die and did not live, and no longer understood that there had ever been a difference. The supply closet held the cotton bundles. It also held a window. The window was small, a square of glass set too high in the wall to be useful. Laura dragged over a box of adult diapers and climbed onto it. When she looked out, she saw the fields beyond the building, fields gone wild, gone to seed, stretching toward a horizon that refused to shift no matter how long she watched. There was no road. She could see where a road should have been, a pale curve where gravel once lay, but grass had claimed it, weeds had swallowed it. Growth thick and patient spoke not of weeks but of years, of long neglect, of abandonment that had been complete. Willowbrook sat in those fields like something that had not been built, but grown, like something native to the land, something that had never required an approach because It had never been meant to be reached. Something that could not be left because it had never allowed an exit. She climbed down. She walked to the front entrance, a place she realized she had been avoiding, though she could not remember deciding to avoid it. The doors were glass, reinforced with wire mesh. Institutional, permanent. Through them she could see the porch, the rocking chairs, the gravel circle where cars should have arrived, the drive that vanished into darkness. She pushed. The doors did not move. She pulled. The handles did not shift. There was no resistance, no sense of being locked. They simply refused the idea of opening. Laura pressed her palms flat against the glass. Her reflection stared back at her, calm and unsurprised. The reflection had never believed the doors would open. It had always known they were not meant for that. She tried the kitchen exit. The handle turned. The door stayed still. She tried the laundry room window. It had been painted shut, not recently. The paint lay thick and layered, sealing the seam until window and wall were one continuous surface. She stood at the end of the west corridor and looked at the basement door. And she understood. It was the only door in Willowbrook that ever opened, the only one that led anywhere, the only one that mattered. Donna was there, or had always been there, or had arrived at the moment Laura became ready to see. "You're settling in," Donna said gently. And Laura understood, with the quiet certainty of something remembered rather than learned, that settling was not a process. It was a destination. The words weighed on Laura like observation rather than small talk, the clinical tone of someone reading a diagnosis aloud. She did not know how to respond. She had been settling in for what felt like weeks or months or years, and time had lost all meaning, bleeding into itself until even the word weeks seemed foreign, a fragment of a language she had once spoken and forgotten. "The new ones always try the doors," Donna said, her voice steady, almost matter-of-fact. "The ones who aren't ready, but you'll understand soon. We all understand eventually." Her braid swung down her back like a pendulum, heavy, pulling at something unseen. Her eyes were a gray that might have been green, a green that might have been gray, a color that refused to settle, refused to be named. Laura tried to ask a question. What happens? But the question fractured before it left her lips. What happens when the doors do open? When the calendar never changes? When the residents neither live nor die and don't know they should? "What happens is what's supposed to happen," Donna said, voice calm, absolute. "What happens is what's always happened. The settling, it takes time, but you have time. We all have time." Donna walked away, her braids swaying with each step. Laura noticed then that Donna cast no shadow, or perhaps the shadow she cast was wrong, pointing a different way, moving on its own. The wrongness was subtle but insistent, like the smell beneath the lavender, faint, impossible to ignore, undeniable. Laura looked down at herself. Her shadow stretched correctly across the floor, away from the flickering fluorescent lights, but it seemed thinner than it should be, faint as though her solidity was still optional. Later, Perline called her into an office she had never noticed before, a door that had not existed until now. The room smelled of memory and dust, of years folded into corners. Wood paneling from the 1970s, a desk both too large and impossibly present. Certificates with dates she could not read, names she could not pronounce. Perline sat behind it as though she had always belonged there, as though she had always been the room's anchor, her function permanent, unchanging. "You've been with us for some time now," Perline said. The words were not a question, nor an observation. They were a fact dropped into the room like a stone in still water, creating ripples Laura could feel in her chest. The adjustment period is difficult, she continued. The body remembers what the mind wants to forget, but you are doing well, learning the rounds, learning the songs. Laura's throat hummed, unbidden, matching the first note of the tune she had been learning. Her body was confirming what Perline said before her mind could catch up. We need good nurses here, people who understand the work, people who know that caring for someone means more than keeping them alive. Perline's hands rested on the desk, thin as parchment, knuckles white beneath skin that seemed older than the building, older than the fields beyond, older than the very idea of care. You understand, don't you? You've always understood. That's why you came. Laura searched her memory, tried to remember why she had applied, why she had walked into this place, and found only a white space, a blank page that seemed to solidify the longer she looked at it. She had come because she was needed. She had come because work awaited, because someone had to sit with the dying to ease them through whatever passage awaited. And if the passage did not lead away, if the dying returned, if it repeated endlessly, well, that was the work now. I don't remember applying for this job, Laura said, her voice raw, unused, as though she had not spoken in weeks, in months, in time she could not measure. Perline smiled, or something like a smile. It reached her lips but not her eyes, or perhaps reached them too slowly, as if the expression had to decide whether it wanted to be warm or something else entirely. No, she said softly. You wouldn't remember. Not tonight, not tomorrow, not any night that contains all the nights that were and all the nights that will come. Laura turned toward the dining room mirror. She saw herself, her brown hair threaded with gray she had stopped hiding years ago, the face of 43 years etched with lines that deepened whether she smiled or not. But something was wrong. The reflection moved with a delay, a hesitation, as if it were weighing whether to follow her, whether to stay tethered at all. Laura raised her right hand. Her reflection mirrored it, but too slowly, arriving a heartbeat late, sinking to a rhythm that was not hers but the building. The 1, 2, 3 pause of the flickering lights. In the dining room, the residents did not notice. They ate powdered eggs, moved through gestures rehearsed 1,000 times over, caught in loops that were not mornings because morning never came to Willowbrook, because the calendar never changed, because time either had stopped, had never started, or flowed in a direction that could not be called forward. Laura stepped closer to the mirror, nose almost touching the glass. Her reflection stared back with eyes that were her eyes but were not, a face that was hers but rewritten. Its expression was patient, certain, waiting, like Mrs. Atrix watching for Leonard, like Mr. Comtock reading his October newspaper, like someone who had all the time in the world because time had lost all meaning. She touched the mirror. Her reflection touched the mirror. For a single, impossible moment between the 1, 2, 3 and the pause, she felt the glass give beneath her fingertips, pliable like skin, something pressing back from the other side. A memory rose in that instant, not from the mirror, not from her mind, but from somewhere in the gaps between duty and wandering. She had been driving, a county road at night she did not know, following GPS directions to a job interview that seemed too good to be true. Generous pay, remote location, a woman's voice on the phone, crackling leaves, distant thunder, something impossibly old speaking through wires. And then it stopped. The memory ended cleanly, sharply, as though snipped with scissors. There was the road, the dark, the GPS voice. Turn right in 500 feet, and then nothing. Then Willowbrook, the lavender, the unchanging clock, the feeling of having been here always, never anywhere else. She pressed against the memory, reaching into the nothing beyond, but the nothing had weight. It was solid. It was a wall built of forgetting, pressing back every time she leaned in. The corridor lights flickered again. 1, 2, 3, pause. 1, 2, 3, pause. And Laura understood with a clarity that felt like falling. Time was not lost here. Time was contained, held, curated, and she, like the residents, was part of the collection. Laura looked at the clock. October, always October, forever October, and in that frozen number she understood. October was the month she had stopped, the month she had been cut from the flow of time, sliced from the life she thought she was living. October had brought her here, tethered her to this place, made her part of its rhythms in ways she was only beginning to comprehend. She told herself the basement was just a basement, the cold room just a cold room, the bodies beneath the white sheets just bodies, waiting for transport, for family, for the slow machinery of death to claim them. But she found herself at the basement door again and again, pressing her palm to the cold metal, feeling something on the other side that was not absence but presence. Waiting. A sound, not silence, but a pulse, a breathing that echoed the humming. 1, 2, 3, pause. 1, 2, 3, pause. The rhythm had become her heartbeat, her thought pattern, the pulse of her existence. The key appeared in her pocket one night she had long since stopped counting. She did not remember taking it. She did not remember placing it there. But her hand found it, warm, alive, insistent. The key to the basement door, the key Perlin kept, the key that should not exist outside Perlin's grasp. She held it, days, weeks. Time had lost meaning here. The warmth in her pocket pulsed as though it knew she would use it eventually, as though it had been waiting for her. And then one night when the lights flickered in a new pattern, 1, 2, pause, 1, 2, pause, as if the building itself was holding its breath, Laura walked to the basement door. She slid the key into the lock, turned it. The door gave, groaning, and the stairs fell away beneath her feet, deeper than stairs should go, deeper than any basement could logically extend. Down and down into a cold that had weight, cold that pressed against her skin like living hands. The walls shifted from institutional cinder block to rough stone, damp and sweating, as if she were descending into the earth itself, into a place that had existed long before the building, before the fields, before anyone had conceived the notion of a building in a field. At the bottom, the cold room opened before her, larger than she remembered, larger than it should have been. The cold room stretched on, endless, fading into darkness that was not darkness, but something else, something that had chosen not to be light. Gurneys lined the stone floor in impossibly long rows, more than she remembered. Dozens of white shapes beneath white sheets, breathing together, waiting together, caught in the fragile threshold between who they had been and what they were becoming. Laura walked between the rows. Her feet made no sound. Her breath left no mist in the cold that was not cold, the cold that wore cold as a disguise, hiding what it truly was. She peered beneath the nearest sheets. Mrs. Gable, lips moving silently in words that were hers alone. Mr. Comtock, hands folded across his chest. Others she recognized from the corridors, from the dining room, trapped in their endless loops, repeating gestures and phrases without knowing that time had stopped. And there at the far end, on a gurney set slightly apart, was a shape that was different. Smaller, wrapped in a sheet wider than the others, its metal tag catching the dim light. Laura's hand reached for it, moving through air that seemed to resist her, through cold that pressed back, through something unseen that tried to stop her but could not. The tag read, Jane Doe, vehicle accident, County Road 71014, brought from overflow. Laura pulled back the sheet. The face beneath was hers, her hair brown with streaks of gray she had long stopped coloring. The lines around her eyes, the ones that deepened whether she smiled or did not, were hers. But the eyes were closed. The skin pale, waxen, lips slightly parted. Nothing moved, nothing breathed, nothing waited. This body had crossed the threshold. This body had settled. Laura stood frozen above it, staring at the self that had been driving down that county road in October, following GPS directions to a job that seemed too good to be true. The self that had taken that right turn in 500 feet and found this. Now she saw the damage, the bruise at the temple hidden beneath hair, the slight twist of the neck that would never align naturally. The stillness, so absolute, was not sleep. It had never been sleep. It was the stillness of the moment after life had decided to stop, after time had chosen its prisoner, after her body had been delivered to the place where waiting could end. And somewhere in the dark beyond the gurneys, the other shapes shifted slightly, breathing in rhythm with the humming that had become her heartbeat. Waiting, watching. But she, Laura, was not waiting. She was the one who had arrived too late. Everything stopped. The county hospital's morgue had overflowed. That was a fact the tag told her, a fact that explained nothing, and yet explained everything. The overflow had come here to Willowbrook, to the cold room, to the staff who knew the rituals, the songs, the words that could refuse death its finality. They had performed the comfort rounds on her body. Bundles pressed beneath her sheet, herbs burned, words spoken, the tune hummed, a tune her throat had already learned before she even knew it existed. And she had risen. Not her body. Her body lay on the gurney beneath the white sheet, complete, finished, untouched by life. But something had risen. Something had refused the settling. Something had climbed the basement stairs, donned scrubs, stood at the nurse's station, and watched the unmoving clock, calling itself Laura, because that was the name it remembered, the identity it clung to, the self it was not yet ready to release. She did not scream. Screaming required breath. Breath required lungs. Lungs required a body. Her body was lying on the gurney with a tag that said Jane Doe. No one had identified her. No one had claimed her. No one had come looking for the woman who had driven down a county road in October and never arrived. Her fingers touched her face, the face that was standing, alive with sensation, staring down at the face lying on the gurney. Cheek to cheek, fingers brushing skin that was both her own and not her own. Real, unreal, meaningless in Willowbrook's logic. The breathing continued all around her. The shapes beneath the sheets inhaled and exhaled in rhythm with the humming. Each one caught at the threshold, held back from settling by rituals older than the building, older than the fields, older than the very idea that death could be denied. They were like her, all of them. People who had died, been brought here, and been refused the finality they were meant to find. People walking corridors, eating powdered eggs, watching televisions that moved too fast to track, blind to the truth of their own existence. And now Laura understood. Mrs. Hendricks had a body somewhere in this room. Mr. Comtock had a gurney breathing with the rest, waiting for a settling that would never come. Every resident who appeared alive, smiling, eating, obeying routines, they were only half there. Ghosts in bodies that refused to know they were gone. And she had joined them. The settling would end, Pearl said, but only because someone understood that it could. Only because someone knew the songs, knew the words, knew the rhythm that pulled the body back from the nothing. You were meant to know, she said, not with her lips, not with her voice, but with the weight that hung in the corridor, in the flicker of the lights, in the pause between heartbeats that didn't belong to any body. Laura felt the pull of the empty room behind her. The bed made up in white sheets waiting had always been waiting for her for this. She understood now that October had never been a month. October was a hinge, a turning point, a threshold. And the accident, the road, the GPS voice, they had only guided her here, had only opened the doors to a place where waiting could be measured, where refusal could be maintained, where bodies could breathe even when the self above them moved in scrubs and thought itself alive. It wasn't death, it wasn't life. It was something older than hospitals, older than fields, older than the idea of time itself. Pearl had taught her the first rule. To care meant more than to keep alive. To care meant to hold the threshold, to understand the refusal, to become the waiting without needing to ask why. Laura turned back to the nurse's station. The clock ticked, 3:47. Each tick felt like a promise. A slow pulse that stitched together the fractured moments of her existence. The corridors were correct now. The building had accepted her, and she had accepted the building. The cold room, the basement, the rows of bodies, all of it could be faced because she knew. She understood what had risen, what had walked above the gurneys, and why she had been chosen. Pearl's face remained unchanged, settled into the permanence of someone who had long since stopped needing breath to speak. "You came to us already dying," she said again, softer this time, almost a whisper that echoed down the corridor. "But you stayed. That is the difference. That is the gift." Laura exhaled, and it felt like the first exhale she had ever taken. Not her body's exhale, not the breathing that continued below in the basement. Her exhale, the one that belonged to the self that had risen, that had walked the halls, that had learned the songs, learned the words, learned the weight of refusal. She looked once more at room 22. The bed waited, the empty room waited, and she understood she would never leave. But she did not need to, because waiting was no longer a punishment. Waiting was her purpose. Waiting was the rhythm, the song, the refusal, the acceptance, all in one. Outside, the wind moved through the fields that no longer mattered. Time was passing. Life, death, the building, the rooms, they were nothing without understanding, and Laura understood. Finally, she stepped forward. She could become still. She could let the last thread loosen and slip free. She could stop holding herself together by habit alone. Or she could turn away. Laura reached out and touched the bed. The mattress dipped under her hand, yielding, welcoming. It would be easy. Easier than everything she had already done. Easier than remembering songs she had never learned. Easier than humming a tune her throat had memorized without permission. Easier than walking hallways knowing what walked beside her and what lay beneath. She imagined the settling as quiet, not pain, not fear, just a lowering like dusk finally deciding to be night, a completion, an ending that did not ask anything more of her. She also imagined Mrs. Atrix in her chair, eyes lifted every time footsteps passed the door. Imagine the calm in that waiting, the way certainty had smoothed her sharp edges. Imagine Mr. Comstock humming along with the television, not knowing why the tune felt familiar. Imagined all of them continuing, held in place by care, by hands that adjusted blankets and voices that said it's all right. I'm here even when here was not a place that should exist. Pearl watched her without watching. The building listened. Laura straightened the sheet on the bed, smoothing a wrinkle that did not need smoothing. A nurse's habit, a small act of care, automatic and precise. She realized then that the choice had already been made, not in this room, not tonight, but long before, on the county road, in the moment when everything had stopped and something in her had refused to follow. "I know how to do the work," Laura said. Pearl inclined her head, not approval, recognition. Laura stepped back into the corridor. The room behind her remained ready. It would always remain ready. She understood that now. The settling was patient. It could wait longer than anything else. The clock at the nurse's station ticked forward, 3:48. The sound was soft, almost kind. Laura took her place behind the desk. She picked up the clipboard. Names, routines, notes written in careful hands. She began the rounds. Somewhere below, her body breathed, still and steady, held in suspension by rituals older than the idea of mercy. Somewhere above, she hummed a tune that no longer frightened her. Willowbrook held, and Laura stayed. Thing, warm as something that had been waiting for her touch, not resisting, not demanding, simply present. The key in her pocket tingled in response, a soft vibration that pulsed through her fingers like a heartbeat, in rhythm with the humming she no longer needed to hear. Her body remembered it, even as her mind tried to keep up. She turned the key. The lock clicked without protest. The stairs yawned before her, descending into the cold that was no longer threatening, only patient, only expectant. Each step she took echoed faintly against the stone, not like sound, but like acknowledgement. She reached the bottom, and the cold room stretched endlessly. More gurneys than she had counted before, more shapes beneath white sheets, waiting, breathing, paused at the threshold, suspended between what had been and what might have been. Her own body lay on a gurney, Jane Doe, County Road 7, marked and still. She looked at it, and there was no horror, no grief, just the quiet, inevitable truth of what had already happened. The ritual had held her here, kept her from the settling, but she understood now that the holding was not punishment, it was purpose. It was the reason she had come, the reason she had risen from the gurney to stand at the nurse's station, the reason she could walk the corridors and care for the ones who would never leave. Laura knelt beside her own body. She traced the curve of her face, the line of her jaw, the small crease at the corner of her closed eyes. Nothing stirred. Nothing moved. The sheet was smooth, the tag visible. She allowed herself a small, private moment. A recognition, a connection, a silent promise. The self beneath the sheet would not be forgotten. The self above it would continue the work. She rose. The humming began again automatically, though no one sang it aloud. It flowed from her bones, her muscles, her breath, carrying through the room, filling the corners where darkness had been waiting. Webb entered with the smoking bowl. Donna brought the bundles. Pearline spoke the words. The residents, suspended between life and its refusal, inhaled and exhaled in perfect rhythm. They did not know her, but they knew the tune. They always knew the tune. Laura straightened, brushed her hands on her scrubs, and began the rounds. Each bed, each resident, each breathing pause and shift in the rhythm was familiar now, a language she spoke without thinking. The building seemed to breathe with her, corridors stretching and shrinking as necessary, walls humbly containing the weight of waiting. She walked the halls as one who knew what it meant to refuse the ending, and what it meant to accept the duty that came with that refusal. She was no longer entirely herself, nor entirely other. She was nurse, witness, participant, caretaker, and threshold. She was Willowbrook, and Willowbrook would endure. Always been, had always existed in the spaces between heartbeats, in the rhythm of the humming, in the pauses of her own breath. It took the awareness of time, the loops, the waiting, the patient certainty of those who had refused to end. It took the knowing that she had chosen, that her choice had shaped the world above and the world below, that her presence had carried what had been suspended into motion. Her body on the stone floor felt the currents of release sweep through it. It was not fear, nor pain, nor relief. It was the fullness of conclusion, the quiet understanding that all the things she had held, all the roles she had played, all the resistance and acceptance, were folding into one inevitable, necessary closure. The cold of the stone was nothing against the warmth of the release, the heat of inevitability that flowed from knowing, from settling, from allowing. One by one, the edges of herself that had been stretched between life and refusal, between the living and the dead, between what had been and what would be, dissolved into the rhythm of Willowbrook. The humming became a sigh, a single note stretched to infinity, and she let herself become part of it. The corridors, the rooms, the clock that finally moved, the calendar that finally turned, the light that flickered in normal rhythm, they were hers to witness, hers to let go of, hers to fold into the final breath of the building itself. She closed her eyes beneath the stone. The settling moved deeper through muscle, through bone, through memory, until nothing remained that needed holding, nothing that clung to difference or resistance. The lavender smell was all around her and yet not, the air itself breathing her in and letting her go. The cold room had emptied its waiting, its threshold no longer needed. The bodies, the residents, the loops, they all leaned into the quiet, the absence, the completion. Laura felt the last tether slip. She was whole and yet not, present and yet dissolved, the final note of the humming resonating in every corner of her being. The settling was complete. The release was complete. And for the first time she could let everything, herself, her choices, her body, her memories, finally rest. Death for too long finally realizing the fight was over. But there was no panic, no grasping, just the slow, inevitable quiet of something finally allowed to finish. Pearline felt the building exhale around her. Not the humming breath it had held for decades, not the ritualized rhythm that had kept the threshold intact, but a real breath, an ending breath, the kind that loosens walls and releases dust and lets light reach places that had never known it. Willowbrook was becoming a building again, just a building, wood and stone and aging pipes, no longer a refusal made solid. She looked at her hands. They were trembling, not with fear, but with age asserting itself all at once. Years she had postponed came rushing back into her joints, her spine, her thinning skin. The mercy she had chosen had demanded payment, and the bill had simply been deferred. The clock ticked. Each second landed cleanly. No pause, no stutter, no 1, 2, 3 hold. Pearline closed her eyes. She remembered the first night, the first body she had refused to let go, the first song she had learned, trembling and unsure, believing with the certainty of youth that keeping was kindness, that ending was cruelty. She had been wrong, but not maliciously wrong, just human, just afraid of the quiet that comes after the last breath. She thought of Laura, not with regret, not with guilt, with something steadier. Gratitude, perhaps. Laura had done what Pearline no longer could. She had allowed knowledge to matter, had allowed truth to break the loop, had chosen release over usefulness, ending over endless need. The bed beneath Pearline creaked softly as she leaned back. The settling began the way it always had. A loosening first, the ache of holding easing out of her chest, the rituals slipping from her grasp like words forgotten on waking, the songs losing their shape, becoming sound, then silence, the purpose she had worn like armor thinning, cracking, falling away. She felt the threshold dissolve. For the first time in longer than memory, Pearline was not needed. And in that absence of need, she found peace. The building did not resist. It did not hum. It did not try to hold her. Willowbrook let her go the way it had finally let everyone go, quietly, without ceremony, without refusal. Morning light filled the room. Outside, somewhere beyond the fields, time continued its unremarkable march. Cars drove county roads. GPS voices spoke directions that led where they promised. October stayed in its place on the calendar, no longer stretched into eternity. The settling finished. Willowbrook became empty. And then slowly, inevitably, it became forgotten. Which was how it was always meant to be. The echo of Willowbrook lingered in the world like a sigh no one could hear. The soil remembered the bodies that had once walked above it. The air remembered the corridors that had hummed with impossible rhythms. The wind carried faint traces of the lavender that had masked something older, something persistent. But time moved, inexorable, indifferent, carrying November into December, years into decades, until even memory of the facility became a thin rumor. The plots in the cemetery, numbered and anonymous, held the remnants of lives that had refused to end and finally had. Jane Doe rested there, alongside the others, her chart crumbled to dust, her story reduced to facts and numbers, but not entirely. Somewhere in the quiet, in the stillness between crops and wind, the settling whispered, completing itself, finishing what had once been interrupted. No one remembered Willowbrook. No one remembered the residents, the rituals, the humming, the threshold. And yet, in the hidden corners of the earth and the faint pulse of the wind, it persisted, not as horror, not as mystery, but as a mercy, patient and unyielding, taking back what had been borrowed, releasing what had been held too long, ensuring that endings at last would be allowed to exist. And that was enough.